I have a theory. We disciple others how we ourselves were discipled.
Welcome to Teach Through the Word. This is the Bible Teachers Podcast. Chris Langham with you again. And back in the interviewee chair for one final episode is our guest, our in-house guest, you might say, guest teacher, Peyton Jones. Welcome back, Peyton.
I thank you.
You should thank me. You should feel welcome here.
There was an awkward pause for a moment there.
The awkward pause there is because I was literally sitting and waiting like, what is Peyton going to do to mess with me this time? But you didn't. You didn't. I had my defenses up.
Because, yeah, no, that was great. See, but that was it. I was throwing you off. See, this was judo. I was using your own momentum against you right then.
Oh, you like, right. I expected it so much. I became my own worst enemy. All right, we're finishing up part 5 in our interview today. Today we're going to talk about training others, passing on what you've learned, a little bit of 2 Timothy 2:2. But before we do that, let's do the intro. This is the Bible Teachers Podcast. We are here to equip you, Bible teacher, to do what you do better, and together with you to elevate the craft of Bible teaching. Get equipped, get trained, and while you're at it, get a behind-the-scenes look here at Through the Word. And let's start it off right there. 2 Timothy 2:2. I'm going to read it for you. This is my go-to verse when it comes to training others. This one is right at the heart of what we're doing right now, what this podcast is about. Paul says to Timothy, "And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." What does that verse mean to you?
That's actually, I've got a really fancy little picture of that in my book, Church Plantology, where it shows like a diagram. Because, as you pointed out the other day when we were recording, there are 4 generations. There's Paul telling Timothy to train those who are also able to train others. That's 4 levels of training. Training is such an important, crucial, and essential and central part of the New Testament and its definition of ministry. It is part of making disciples. So you know this, Chris, that Ephesians 4 is foundational to how I think of ministry. It's all about equipping others. So as an apostolic leader, which I would say is a fancy word for sent one missionary, I'm always wired for mission. If I go into urban Long Beach, if I'm left to myself, without the balance of a shepherd, a teacher, an evangelist, I make it a mission station, right? And so when you're talking about the flavors of leader that Paul talks about there, you're really talking not so much about strengths as much as weaknesses and blind spots. So I'm a terrible shepherd, right? Like we were talking recently where Jonathan, you and I were texting, and I just made some ridiculous comment that was funny, whereas a normal person, someone with a huge shepherding gift, would come in and say, "Oh man, I'll pray for you." But no, not Peyton Jones, right? Because he's more apostolic. It's all about mobilizing and yada yada. But my role is to reproduce myself. To this end, like when you came to Refuge Long Beach, that was my number one thing. I was like, Chris is a teacher. Like that would be your slot in Ephesians chapter 4. So I remember we talked, and I'm like, hey man, can you just reproduce yourself? Just raise people up as teachers. And all of the people that I had been training apostolically, training them about, kind of, I guess, how I was wired, you were able to come in and reproduce yourself and pour into them, your gifts and your expertise as a teacher. And I think that's just always what it is. I mean, I look at Jesus, his core of his 3 years really were, if you look at the thing he consistently did, and probably what he spent the majority of his time on, was training 12 people, pouring himself in, training, passing on to the next generation.
That's good. So where did that transformation happen in your ministry? It's interesting because for you and I, we talk about a lot of our history together, but actually our paths were close together for a time and then diverged into opposite continents. We're on 2 sides of the pond for more than a decade. and then our paths came back together, and there was a big difference between the you that I knew early on and then who you became. By the time we got back together, you were focused almost primarily, entirely on training others. Tell us where in your story that that transition happened to make that focus. How did God call you to that?
That's an interesting journey because when I train people to disciple others, I usually will say most of you in here probably wouldn't have the foggiest clue where to start discipling somebody. And that's because I have a theory. We disciple others how we ourselves were discipled. So, case in point, the guy who discipled me, he discipled me by taking me through First John and just asking me, what do you think he means? And we did that for weeks and weeks. To this day, 30 years on, that's what I still do. When I disciple a new believer, we go through First John. I'll be discipling somebody tonight. We'll be painting miniatures because that's the nerd hobby he's into, and
Yeah.
we'll do a discipleship session. And so when people haven't been discipled, they don't know what to do. But I was very fortunate to have people pour into me as a teacher from almost the very moment I got saved. And then that gift continued to grow, and people kept watering it. People kept fanning it into flame with me. I kept working hard at it. And then, so I always did what was done for me. If I saw a young man, I would then start to train him and to pour into him and give him opportunity. I remember one time you asked me to come preach at Refuge Long Beach, and I said I'll do it, but only if I can take Cameron, who was a African American young man in the church, and I was like, only if he can come and share the pulpit with me that morning. I
Mm.
love pouring into others. And where the transition really happened was when I started seeing the Apostle Paul do it intentionally. So if I look at Paul's trajectory, when he was on his first missionary journey, he didn't leave anyone behind. And the Galatian heresy happened in the wake of his first missionary journey. So on his second missionary journey, he goes back to Galatia, picks up Timothy at Lystra and Derbe, and he starts bringing him with and training him. And so I started learning, like, not only did Paul
Mm.
do that, he starts picking up all these different people, Silas, all these others, and he starts bringing them with him and training and pouring into them. But on his third missionary journey, he parks himself in Ephesus. And at a certain point, I realized I'm planting churches now with the end goal, and it was Refuge Long Beach was the start. Because when I planted my first church, I thought, I'm here to do this to glorify Jesus and reach the lost. But on my second church plant, I realized, no, I'm here to do this to train others. And part of that goes back to that breaking story where it wasn't about me anymore. And I think when you've hit the sweet spot of ministry, you don't want to be the hero anymore. To quote Dave Ferguson, you become the hero maker. You want to pour into others, which is what Jesus did with the 12 again. I mean, we keep coming back to that. Jesus keeps pouring into them to release them into what they're doing. And of course, that's kind of been the legacy of the ministry over the years. As I can look back at all these people that I poured into who are now serving God and are now in ministry and now planting churches. And to me, that's so much more fulfilling. In fact, when I came back to Refuge Long Beach after leaving you there, didn't take long, maybe a year, maybe 2 years. People had no clue who I was, except for the people that were still there. But there have been much, much more people coming to faith there. And they had no clue who I was. And I just remember thinking, there's something beautiful in that. I love this because they know Jesus and they know you now. But it's like when Paul goes, hey, we're nothing. One guy plants, one guy's waters. Nobody's really anything. God makes it grow. And I love kind of reproducing myself and others, if that makes sense.
That's good. That's good. All right, I got two questions for you. I'm gonna let you decide what order to pick them in. You mentioned church planting, you mentioned training. So here's my couple of questions, and you can pick which one you want. When it comes to church planting, you've preached in a lot of different settings, and how does church planting modify the way that you teach? We're doubtless talking to a lot of church planters who are listening. It's a different setting from preaching an established pulpit, established church. My other question for you, what are some key lessons that you like to give to teachers who are just starting out? What are some of those things that you always tell them? All right, you can take your pick which one you want to answer first.
Yeah, so planting with the within a church planting context is very different because you're always dealing with biblically illiterate people. In fact, like I was on a webinar the other day where someone was interviewing me for this book, and people were putting in there like Peyton's the Pope of pop culture. You know, like if they've read my other books, I have a tendency, and you're the same. It's really funny to listen to you and go, God has kind of put us together because we use pop culture, and I know part of it
Yeah.
was you were a minister to youth, you were also a missionary, but I think once you've been a missionary you realize I have to find that common ground to reach people with. So when I was in Britain, they didn't even know what Easter was about. They polled the local schools and they're like, isn't that when the groundhog comes out or Jesus opened up his head and fire shot out? Those are real answers. And so they were so biblically illiterate that I had to use pop culture, and it just became second nature. It became like learning a foreign language when I was overseas to communicate the gospel. And you do that in through the word, which what I would say is if you want to learn to really connect with non-believers, listen to through the word, because that's the thing that I suppose really lets me know I'm in the right spot. Is this is what through the word does so well. It connects. You've always got a mind, Chris, with the people outside of the church, outside of the kingdom, and you're constantly talking to them. You're constantly putting the cookies on the bottom shelf for them. You're not stupid. You're not oversimplifying. You're taking everything that's in the word, making it accessible for everybody. And that's what you have to do when you're in a church planting conversation. The other thing is that you have to see every opportunity to preach as a life and death situation. You have to
Mhm.
see it as I just need to make sure I give these people this Sunday enough to keep them from overdosing on heroin. I need to make sure that I give them enough to keep them from turning tricks to pay the rent next month. I need to make sure that I'm giving them enough Jesus, enough gospel, enough grace, enough of the word, something solid to hold on to so they don't die this week. And that may sound really extreme, but when you're in the urban context of Refuge Long Beach, it really would haunt me that I only have them for an hour every Sunday. And I am worried that if I go up there and I do any kind of antics, or it's the Peyton Jones show, or I'm just trying to go for the cheap laughs and I'm not dependent on the power of the Holy Spirit to really speak prophetically into their hearts, then I am accountable for that. So I think one of the things that preaching is always a heavy deal for me. I'm always terrified. I should tell people that because people don't realize, like, there's not a time that I walk into the pulpit and I'm not terrified, that I'm not absolutely scared out of my head and dependent 100% on the Holy Spirit.
Mhm.
So that, you know,
You need God to do his thing. This is his thing. Okay,
yeah.
let's take it to my next question, which is you've worked with a lot of trainees over the years. You've trained up a lot of people. You've pulled a lot of people off of out of their pews or even off of the sidewalk to pull them into training. And I really observed that about you. Very often, you've pulled somebody who really didn't see themselves yet, but you saw some natural gifts in what they were doing. When you're working with somebody so new, what are some of the key lessons that you're always bringing them, particularly about teaching? When you and it takes some guts to put somebody in the pulpit early on when you know their gift is not fully developed. What are some of those key lessons that seem to come back every time?
It's really funny because I guess when I teach, it's funny because, I was thinking earlier about who are my favorite teachers that are alive. Alistair Begg is one, Chuck Swindoll is another. But I was thinking, man, one of my favorite teachers, and this is a funny answer, is the person in the pulpit for the first couple times because I love watching them. I love Anna. Like, that's my favorite, is just watching them kind of start to learn to fly as Mama Bird pushes them out of the nest, and working with a teacher like that. I love that. And I love all the mistakes they make. I love the humility that comes with that when they do, and the, oh, I blew it, and the, just walking through that with them so that they can learn all these valuable lessons that you and I had to learn. And I just love that. But I suppose, yeah, I mean, pushing people out to do more is a part of my jam. So like even
Mhm.
things like when we baptized people at Refuge Long Beach, I would have them stay there and they would turn and they would baptize the next person like right away. So it wouldn't be just the pastors. It'd be like, no, stay right here. This is part of the Great Commission. You are called to do this. Baptizing others is a part of this commission. So stay right where you're at. One of the first things you get to do as a baptized person is baptize someone else. So in the same way, like in our small groups, like our cogs, we call them, our teaching or our midweeks, we'd be in a living room and I would never just lead a cog. So I would go start up the cogs. But like Ruben, the reason that Ruben ended up eventually in ministry was I just took him and go, hey, um, I'm gonna model the first night what I want you to do, and then the next week I'm gonna give you something. I had an 8-week plan to give Ruben that cog, and it would be like the first night I would do everything. Second night I would let him pray at the beginning. Or third night, I would let him lead communion. Now he's seen me do it 3 times, right? And that first time I led communion, I was terrified. I couldn't believe like I was like, no, Jesus, the body, the blood, what am I doing? And so, I want them to have that, but I want to be right there and walk him through all that. And then I give him like a 5-minute intro. Then I take, the other 5 minutes. There's only 10 minutes of teaching. By the end of that 8 weeks, he's facilitating discussion. He's doing all that. And I'm his training wheels. And then I stay on 1 extra month to watch and to coach him. Then I'm probably starting another cog at the same time, but then I move on. But as far as the number one thing for me is time for a young preacher. Young preachers are notorious for going way, way over. And
Mhm.
Chris, like I know you're no short preacher, but you're a good preacher. I can listen to you for an hour. I can't listen to a brand new preacher for an hour. So the number one
Yeah.
thing I would do is I would hit them on time. You will finish at 10 minutes. You will finish at 15. If you can't do that, you're not cut out for this. And I love it because Wesley, his thing when he would train them, those are the two things he would tell his trainees is he would say, preach about God and preach about 10 minutes.
And speaking of which, I'm going to cut us off for time. Hey, Peyton, thanks for joining us. Thanks for sharing your story of your time with the Lord as a teacher, and all your insights. That will do it for our interview series with Peyton Jones. We're going to come back next week with another Bible book. That's what we do here. This has been the Bible Teachers Podcast. Each week here at Teach Through the Word, we bring you one Bible book or one basic training or one teacher interview as we equip you, Bible teacher, to do what you do better together with you to elevate the craft of Bible teaching. We'll see you next week.